Why, hello, everybody. Welcome to our bazillionth virtual Teen Science Cafe of the spring. Before we get started, I welcome everyone. My name is Cole, as many of you probably know. Before we get started, I would like to throw out a call for volunteers to help with our summer camps at Morehead Planetarium. If you're interested, I'm going to go ahead and put that email in the chat to y'all. It's mpsc_camps at unc.edu. You do all kinds of stuff with the kiddos. You can help teach, you help just manage the children because they're kind of wild and fun. And you kind of get to learn how to run a science camp. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, if you're interested, go ahead and email that, which I'll put in there briefly. Before I introduce my other moderator and the speaker, I'll go over like how we should. If you have any questions, just go through the Q&A function. It should be at the bottom of your screen. You might see chats from us every once in a while coming from the chat function. And then today we'll also be having a poll come up, so you can answer just by clicking on them, and then we will let you know the results. There'll be a couple polls, so keep an eye out for those and feel free to participate. So without further ado, I will introduce Tamara, who's my fellow moderator. She'll be helping ask y'all's questions that come in through the Q&A. And then I'll introduce Alex. She got her bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley and in marine science, and now she's in her second year PhD program at Duke University. So I'll let you take it from there.
Thanks, Cole. All right, I'm going to share my presentation. Can you guys see? Cole, Tamara, is that working?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. All right. All right. So thank you, Cole, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone who's here today. As Cole mentioned, my name is Alex. I'm a second-year PhD student at Duke University studying in the Earth and Ocean Science Department. And specifically, I study ocean biogeochemistry. So I'm interested in understanding how the biological systems and the chemical systems in the ocean impact climate change. And I know that this is primarily for high school students. And so I'm hoping to tell you guys a little bit about my research, a little bit about the way the ocean plays a role in moderating the Earth's climate. And then also at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about what a day in the life looks like for me as a researcher, and also some of the kind of cool up and coming topics in oceanography, in case that's something you guys are thinking about as a career path. But before I dive in, I want to tell you guys a little bit about me and where I got my start. So I grew up on the west coast of North America, and I spent a lot of time as a kid exploring tide pools and the beach and looking at sea stars and everything in these tide pools. And this is actually a picture from the 90s of me and my brother and my mom staring through the little slats in the fishing dock looking at the anemones that grew underneath. So I was always kind of fascinated with the ocean and ocean ecosystems. And as I grew up and went to high school, I started scuba diving. And this allowed me to explore some of my research questions and my science questions about the ocean from underwater. I then went to college at the University of California, Berkeley, and I studied marine science. And I joined a research lab in my sophomore year that allowed me to study an Indo-Pacific clam called the disco clam. And that allowed me to not only go into the field and do scuba diving research, but also in 2 years of working in the lab, I really fell in love with the scientific process and the way that science allows us to use experiments and data analysis and observation to answer questions that we have about the Earth. So that's kind of where I got started and why I got interested in marine science. As a graduate student, I chose to focus my research more on climate change and on the role that the ocean plays in climate. So moving up from a smaller coral reef ecosystem up to a larger global Earth system. And I should say that I like to keep these talks pretty informal, so please feel free to add questions, and Cole and Tamara will interrupt me as I go along. Normally, if we were doing this in person, I would ask for input from you guys about what greenhouse gases are. However, since we're on Zoom, I'm just going to answer. Greenhouse gases are gases in the atmosphere that help trap heat and insulate the planet. So some of the classic examples would be carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Now, it's important to remember when we're thinking about greenhouse gases that a certain amount of greenhouse gas is important for us in the atmosphere. It does help insulate the planet, and it creates a habitable planet for humans and plants and animals to live. So can anybody, this is going to be our first polling question, if anyone can tell me where greenhouse gases come from.
All right, so yes, first polling question is, where do greenhouse gases come from? As Alex said, cars, trucks, SUVs, power plants, microbes, cows, volcanoes, or all of the above. If y'all could just click your answer and push submit. And we'll let you know how you did. Ooh, okay.
All right.
Yes, we have 6% said power plants and 94% said all of the above. So Alex, care to explain which one?
Yes. So the correct answer is all of the above. So on this slide, this is kind of a basic schematic of the global carbon cycle that I took from the Global Carbon Project. And it shows different pools and fluxes of carbon that we have in the atmosphere. So these little circles represent reserves of carbon or stocks of carbon. So you can see that we have some in fossil fuels. We also have natural reserves of carbon. So things like permafrost, soils, also vegetation, all biomass is going to have some carbon in it, including humans. And then we also have these aerofluxes. And so these fluxes represent a movement of carbon from one pool to another pool. And so we can see that we do have some natural sources and sinks for carbon. We have some sources of carbon, a very small source from volcanic activity that's going to release carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. We also have an exchange of carbon dioxide with vegetation because plants do photosynthesis and convert carbon dioxide into organic carbon. So sugars, proteins, biomass, different things like that. And that organic carbon is no longer part of the greenhouse gas system in the atmosphere. We also have fluxes of carbon out of the Earth system in different changes in land use. So when we deforest areas for agriculture, for example, we're actually releasing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we're removing some of those carbon sinks that we would see from a forest. We also have a natural sink for carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the ocean. And that's primarily what we're going to be talking about today. And the really big source of greenhouse gases that plays a role in climate change is this gray arrow, this 9.4 gigatons of carbon per year that go into the atmosphere from human activity, so burning of fossil fuels. So going back to that polling question, power plants and industrial sources are going to be a big source of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. All of our motor vehicles that are gas powered, so cars, trucks, SUVs, airplanes, everything like that. But it's important to know that there are also natural sources of carbon for the atmosphere. And it's important to think about this because before humans and before the Industrial Revolution started, the Earth was relatively in balance, where we had these pools of carbon and we had these fluxes between these pools, but it was relatively balanced. And there were a lot of feedback loops in it that kind of kept the atmosphere in a stable, with a stable concentration of greenhouse gases. And so this gray input, this gray arrow from anthropogenic sources is really what's causing climate change. So if we go to our second polling question, you can see here on this slide that I have a couple boxes covering some pools. And I want to see if you guys can tell me, have any inclination about these pools of carbon in the atmosphere and in the ocean.
All right, so our second polling question will come up soon. All right, here's our second polling question. Which has the bigger stock or reservoir of carbon, the ocean or the atmosphere? So go ahead and submit your answers. Give you a couple seconds. And I'm going to submit mine. All right, so I've given you guys a few seconds. And all right, so the results are in. We have 88% of you guys said the ocean and 12% of you guys said the atmosphere. Alex, which one is it?
Great job. The answer is the ocean.
Awesome.
So if we're looking at this global carbon cycle schematic, we see that we have a pool of about 860 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. In comparison, we have about 700 gigatons of organic carbon in the ocean. So like I said, organic carbon is things like sugars, proteins, any sort of biomass. So the total amount of carbon that's stored in the ocean in this organic form is roughly equivalent to the amount that we have in the atmosphere that is part of this greenhouse gas system. And then we also have a really large pool in the ocean of dissolved inorganic carbon, 38,000 gigatons. So it's orders of magnitude higher than the amount of carbon that we have in the atmosphere. So it's important when we're thinking about the global carbon cycle to see that the ocean is really the largest reserve or reservoir of carbon that we have on the surface of the planet. And we see this in data as well. So on this right, the panel on the left, excuse me, is showing the carbon dioxide buildup in the atmosphere from 1960 to today. Before the Industrial Revolution in 1750, the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide was about 270 parts per million. That means that out of a million molecules in the atmosphere, about 270 of them were carbon dioxide. Doesn't seem like a lot, but it can play a big role in the climate. By 2017, we had moved up to over 400 parts per million. So that's more than a 46% increase before the Industrial Revolution. And then on this graph on the right, we see a similar trend in ocean carbon sink, or the ocean, the carbon content in the ocean between 1960 and 2017. And so we do see that a lot of this extra carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere is actually being absorbed by the ocean. So that drives this question: how does the ocean play a role in climate? And I'm going to talk about two big mechanisms today that are sinks for carbon in the ocean. These are by no means an inclusive list. There are other ways that the ocean interacts with climate, but these are two big ones that I'm going to talk about. So if you'll bear with me, this is usually something that I do on a whiteboard, but I've tried to convert it into a slide for this Zoom presentation. We know in this, if this is the ocean and the atmosphere, we have industrial sources and anthropogenic sources of carbon dioxide. We also have natural sources of carbon dioxide that go into the atmosphere, and this puts some carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We then have some amount of that carbon dioxide that will actually be dissolved into the ocean. So here's for my last polling question. Can anybody tell me what the temperature effect is of carbon dioxide dissolution? I'll let Cole read the question.
All right, so how does temperature affect the amount of carbon seawater can hold? Colder seawater can hold more carbon, colder seawater can hold less carbon, and seawater can hold the same amount of carbon regardless of temperature. And again, we'll let you know what y'all decide in just a moment. All right, so 59% of folks said colder seawater can hold more carbon. 35% said colder seawater can hold less carbon, and 6% said seawater can hold the same amount of carbon regardless of temperature. So we actually missed the answer to this on our practice poll before this, so I'm also super curious. So Alex, give us an explanation.
Great job, you guys. 59% of you were correct. Colder seawater can hold more carbon dioxide. And this is important because we have these natural flow patterns of water in the ocean. And so in this slide, I've zoomed in kind of on the North Atlantic. We're over here in North Carolina. And we have this current that's moving water on the surface, this shallow water route from the equator north towards the North Pole. And as this water is moving towards the North Pole, it's going from being warm around the equator to much colder as it moves north towards the pole. Another thing that's happening to this water as it's moving north is that it's losing water content to evaporation, and so it's becoming more saline or saltier. And so by the time you have this water that's reached the north, the very far north in the Atlantic, it's very salty and it's very cold. It's also has a very high content of carbon dioxide because of this temperature effect where cold water can hold more carbon dioxide. And so what happens is that when the cold, salty water gets to the North Atlantic, it's more dense than the surrounding water around it, and it ends up sinking. And this drives this overturning circulation, or it's sometimes called an ocean conveyor belt, where you have this water moving northward and getting colder and then sinking. And then you have this deep water route that moves southward again. And this deep water route is holding a lot of carbon dioxide because it was dissolved in the cold water when it sank. Now this deep water route can actually stay sequestered from the atmosphere or stay away from the atmosphere for up to 4,000 years. So this is a really big deal when we think about the fact that climate change and anthropogenic input of carbon dioxide has only really been happening for about 200 to 300 years. And so a 4,000 year time frame for sequestering this carbon can play a really, really big role in climate change. This is just a slightly more complicated schematic of this phenomena that I was describing. So we have these really big currents in the ocean, and we have a couple of places for deep water formation. So we have two up in the North Atlantic by the Labrador Sea. And we also have two in the Southern Ocean near Antarctica, where you have this deep water formation that's driving a lot of this large scale ocean circulation. So this is going to account for a lot of that 38,000 gigatons of carbon that we see in inorganic forms in the ocean. So this is a really big mechanism for pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sequestering it in the ocean. The second mechanism that I'm going to be talking about is called the biological carbon pump. And this is something that I actually am actively researching. So I'm going to go a little bit more into detail about it. So this is a schematic that came from NASA's Ocean Exports project. This is a project that I'm actively working on as part of my dissertation. So I'm going to try and break this down. It's a very complicated looking schematic, and I'm going to try and break it down piece by piece. But if you guys have more questions about this, oceanexports.org is a great place to go. They've got a lot more information and content like this. So if we focus just at the beginning on the surface part of the ocean, this part of the ocean is called the euphotic zone, and it's where light penetrates. So once you get to a certain depth in the ocean, there's really no light anymore. And the depth of the euphotic zone is between 200 and 300 meters, or about 2 to 3 football fields in depth. So it's pretty large, but compared to the entire ocean, it's like a little thin layer at the top. And in this thin layer, because there's light available, we have organisms that can do photosynthesis. So that's going to be our phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are a little bit like the plants of the sea. They're doing photosynthesis and converting inorganic carbon or carbon dioxide into organic carbon, sugar, biomass, their own body biomass, all of that. We also have heterotrophs in the ocean, which are organisms like us that cannot produce our own energy. We can't go sit outside and photosynthesize as much as I wish that I could. We have to consume food for our own energy. And so you have zooplankton in the ocean that eat these phytoplankton, or higher up the trophic level will eat other zooplankton and other organisms in the ocean and consume that organic carbon. And so like us, these zooplankton are doing respiration. They're eating food, they're breathing in oxygen, and they're breathing out carbon dioxide. So you have this natural cycle in the surface ocean of carbon dioxide to organic matter back to carbon dioxide. But a certain amount of that organic matter is actually going to stay in organic matter form and stay in the surface ocean. And what we're interested in are the pathways of moving that organic carbon from the surface ocean down into the deep part of the ocean. And so there are a couple pathways that we think about. The first is going to be fecal pellet sinking. And so zooplankton poop, and this poop is pretty dense and it will sink out of the surface ocean. It's also pretty sticky. And so you might have what we call fecal pellet aggregates, where you have a bunch of little different poops that stick together and create a bigger poop that sinks through the water column. You also can have aggregation of phytoplankton communities. So if you had a really big bloom of phytoplankton that didn't get all the way eaten by these zooplankton, when those phytoplankton die, they can aggregate together and become these sticky blobs as well that will sink out of the surface ocean. Then if we think about the deep part of the ocean, now that we're trying to connect these two, the big question becomes how much carbon is being exported from the surface ocean, where it's in relative equilibrium with the atmosphere. So the carbon is not really sequestered, it's not exported out. Once it gets into the deep part of the ocean, that's what we call being exported, or sequestered in a deeper part of the ocean, where it can stay in that part of the ocean for days, weeks, months, decades, centuries, even up to a couple thousand years, which, like I said, is a really big deal when we're thinking about climate change being on the scale of only a couple hundred years. So there are a couple mechanisms that actually actively move this carbon down into the deeper part of the ocean as well. The first is physical transport. So you can have areas where you have just rapid water mass movement down into the depths, the deep part of the ocean. We also have something called diel vertical migration, which is really interesting and complicates this process a little bit, because you have some zooplankton, which remember are the heterotrophs. They're the organisms that are eating other organisms. They live down in the deep part of the ocean during the day because it's dark in the deep part of the ocean, and so predators can't see them. And then at nighttime, when the entire ocean is dark, they swim up, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of meters, up to the surface part of the ocean where there's a lot of production and there's a lot of food, and they come and munch on it. And then during the day, again, they swim back down to the deep part of the ocean where they're safe. And when they swim back down, they're of course respiring carbon and creating fecal pellets that they've now transported down to 600, 700, 800 meters in depth. We also have respiration that's happening in the deeper part of the ocean. So you have organisms and bacteria that are eating these fecal pellets as they sink and converting it back from organic matter into inorganic carbon. And so if it's inorganic carbon, but it's trapped in the deep part of the ocean, it still is not creating a greenhouse effect. It's not being part of the Earth's climate system. And so the question becomes, how much of this carbon is being exported out of the surface ocean into the deep part of the ocean? And how long does it stay in the deep part of the ocean based on these other biological systems that are happening? And we have a lot of different ways that we can observe this. So we go out on ships for weeks at a time to measure some of these things. We also have a lot of autonomous platforms that we can put out in the ocean that measure different things. So different floats or gliders that will measure some of these things. And because this is a NASA project, a large part of this also is trying to train a satellite so that we can measure this from space. So the research question that I'm working on for my project is specifically focused on the surface part of the ocean and trying to quantify how much carbon is exported through this biological carbon pump, which is the system that I just described. And there's a couple of ways that we can measure this, but if we think about the surface ocean, we're thinking about something called carbon export potential, or the total amount of carbon that could be exported from the surface ocean into the deep part of the ocean. So in the surface ocean, we know that we have phytoplankton that are doing photosynthesis and converting carbon dioxide into organic matter and oxygen as a byproduct. We also know that autotrophs, or the phytoplankton, the plants in the ocean, need a certain amount of that energy that they've harnessed from photosynthesis to build their own biomass. So we lose some of that organic matter to the phytoplankton themselves. We then have heterotrophic respiration, which occurs when the zooplankton and the other organisms in the ocean eat the phytoplankton and eat each other. And this resultant amount is called NCP, or net community production. So it represents the total photosynthesis minus respiration in this surface ocean system. And what that means, it represents the overall carbon export potential, because all of this carbon that stays in organic matter, that is the net leftover organic matter produced through this process, can get exported to the deep part of the ocean. So that gives us kind of an upper bounds for how much carbon can be exported through this system. And we measure this, there's a couple of ways that we can measure this. So some people measure it by the uptake of carbon dioxide. Some people measure it by the production of organic matter. In my lab, we measure it using oxygen. And so we go out on large research vessels for 6 to 8 weeks at a time. And this is a picture from the Sally Ride, which is a research vessel that I went out on in 2018 to the North Pacific. And so this is the inside of the lab on the ship. And essentially, we have a hose that goes below the ship and pulls water in from the ocean continuously. And we use this water with this mass spectrometer, and we measure the oxygen content in the water. And that allows us to measure this carbon export potential, this oxygen production from photosynthesis. The second question that I have that I'm working on for my research is, how does the biological community actually impact this process? So how does the interactions between these phytoplankton and these zooplankton impact how much carbon export potential there is, or how much net community production there is? And the way that I do that is also while I'm out at sea, I take water samples that I filter and collect all of the microbes on these filters. And then when I get back to the lab, I do something called metagenomic analysis. So this allows me to look at the DNA, not just from one specific microbe in the community, but the DNA from all of the microbes in the entire community. And that allows me to look at who is present, what kind of critters, what kind of microbes are present in the ocean at the time that I took that sample, and how that correlates with our net community production measurements that we took at the same time. So that's how I'm working to answer my research questions. And now quickly, before we finish, I wanted to tell you guys a little bit about what a day in the life looks like for an ocean scientist, and hopefully answer any questions that you guys have about the trajectory from high school to graduate school. So for me, I think the kind of hinging, or the first thing that I do as a researcher is I do field work. I go out on these large ships, that's this picture on the left, out in the ocean and collect this data. Then I do a lot of data analysis back here in Durham. And I also do a lot of lab work where I'm prepping some of the samples, the microbial samples, for DNA work, or any dissolved gas samples that I take. And so one of my absolute favorite things about my job is that there's a lot of variability. I'm not doing one thing for too long. I would say that it's almost equal thirds field work, computer work where I'm doing active data analysis, and lab work. And for me, that's exactly what I wanted. I knew when I was growing up that I really didn't want to have a desk job where I was sitting behind a computer all day. And so this variability is something that I really like about my job. The last big thing that I get to do as a graduate student and as a researcher is teaching. So I am a teacher's assistant for classes at Duke, but I also get to do cool outreach events like this where I get to talk about my research, and that's something that I really like about it. And finally, I just wanted to tell you guys a little bit about, I've covered kind of the two big mechanisms in the ocean that we think about in terms of climate change, but I wanted to give you a taste of some of the other big fields in oceanography right now, and this is by no means an inclusive list, but there is some really cool research going on looking at ocean circulation. It plays a big role in something like the solubility pump, which we talked about at the very beginning. There's also a lot of really interesting geoengineering work going on, looking at ways that we can either leverage these natural systems in the ocean to help with climate change, or also leverage things like wave energy, for example, for a renewable energy source. So that's a really interesting field. If you're not interested in doing field work at all, which I understand, we also have a lot of work going on with things like climate modeling. So you could do a lot of work just with data analysis and with modeling. Omics is this kind of catch-all term for any sort of work that we're doing with DNA. So briefly, genomics is looking at the genetic material of a single organism. Metagenomics allows us to look at, like what I do in my work, the genetic material from an entire community of organisms. And that tells us a little bit about what these microbial communities are doing. And then we also have transcriptomics, which looks at not just the genes that are present in a community, but also whether or not these genes are being expressed, or whether or not the organisms are actually doing these things that these genes code for. And there's a couple other omics fields that are really cool. But this kind of gives us a window into some of the microbial processes that are happening in the ocean. And this is one that I'm really excited about because it's something that's been evolving really quickly over the last maybe 20 years with some of the technology that we have to actually be able to look at these things. There's also a lot of really important research going on right now in ecosystem sciences and conservation. So coral reef restoration, coral reef conservation, also work looking at sustainable fishing and things like that. And then the last one that I had on here, but like I said, this is by no means inclusive. There's also a lot of really cool work on optics and remote sensing. So like I said, the big exports project that I'm working on is part of a NASA initiative to use satellites to be able to look at the Earth and look at the ocean and see, quantify how much carbon is being exported through this biological carbon pump. And so with new technology, we have a lot of different ways to remotely observe the Earth. And that's something that's always up and coming, I think. So with that, I would love to hear your questions. And I put my email here if you guys have anything that you think of later that you want to ask about.
Awesome. Good job, Alex. Very good presentation. I'm going to give the folks a couple of minutes to type in their questions. But in the meantime, I'm actually curious on like, what do you see that's next? Because you're getting your PhD now and you're in your second year. What do you want to do after you get your degree?
For me, I'm interested in the intersection of science and policy. I think that we have a lot of really good scientists working on climate change issues, and that's something that I'm very interested in, obviously. But I think that there is, it's important to be able to bridge the gap between scientific knowledge and policy implementation, and actually trying to build better political and economic systems that help combat climate change. And so that's something that I see myself working on in the future.
Oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Because we definitely need the rules and regulations in place in order to help the planet and like lessen our carbon footprint and things like that.
Yeah.
So speaking of which, with everyone paying attention that's on this webinar right now, what are some like simple things that we could do? Because like you said, a lot of it was caused by people. And I know, of course, like not driving a whole lot is one of them, but what are some other little things that we can do to lessen our carbon footprint?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to speak as a citizen and not as a scientist. There are lots of good ways that you can lower your carbon footprint by, you know, flying a little bit less if you can, driving a little bit less if you can, riding your bike or walking places if you can do that, reducing your use of single-use plastics. So anything that, you know, the petroleum industry actually has a lot to do with plastic creation. And so, you know, bringing your own grocery bags to the store is going to help. You know, bringing your own containers, if you can go to the grocery store and use your own containers, although in a post-COVID-19 world, that might not work anymore. So there are a lot of different ways that you can do that. Also being cognizant of your energy usage in your home. So if you can afford to, or if you have the opportunity to move to more efficient appliances and efficient lighting and things like that, that's a good way to do it. Yeah.
Gotcha. So having my AC on and my window open is not a good thing?
Right, right.
Good to know. Good to know.
And if you can, yeah, if you can handle the heat, like turning your AC on a little bit later in the summer and turning it off a little bit earlier in the fall is a good way to reduce your individual carbon footprint.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Well, we actually have a whole bunch of questions here, and I'm going to have Cole go ahead and ask the first one.
All right. So yeah, we have a question from Ross. He asks, why does cold water absorb CO2 better than warm water?
That is a great question, and I actually don't know the answer.
Oh.
Yeah, it has to do with kinetics.
Yeah, that's
a great question.
It's a really good question. Next question is from McKenna. What other fields and occupations work with you?
That is a really good question. So I work a lot with different types of oceanographers. So my lab specifically works in ocean biogeochemistry. So that's kind of looking at the intersection of all of these biological, chemical, physical properties in the ocean. We work with a lot of optical oceanographers. So those are people that are actually connecting the biological communities to the satellites and looking at the way that light reflects off of different surfaces in the ocean and how that impacts what we read. I also work with a lot of ecologists at Duke. So we have a pretty big ecology program, and I think a lot about ecology when I'm thinking about these biological communities and how they work together. Statistics, I work a lot with statisticians because a lot of this, especially with these really large data sets, and as a field, science is moving towards having really, really large data sets. The need for statisticians and for really high impact statistics is really important. So I work a lot with statistics people as well.
Wow, so it sounds really interdisciplinary. That's really cool that you're working with so many different types of fields. That's awesome. All right. So go ahead, Cole. Go ahead and ask the next question.
All right. So first, Asher, actually, yes, this recording will be made available. It takes a couple days to get on there, but then SST asked a question. What is the coolest thing you've seen on your scuba dives?
That is possibly one of the hardest questions because I think it's all so cool. But I saw a banded sea crate in Indonesia, which was amazing. They're the white and black striped sea snakes that are really poisonous. They're very cool.
Actually, when I was in Greece this past September, I was just kind of swimming along, and I was smart and brought my goggles for the lovely Greek water, and I saw an eel. Just like, I was completely exposed, and I was excited, but I also really didn't care for it because it scared the bejeebers out of me.
That's awesome. We have one last question from Ross. Are the stay-at-home rules reducing the output of CO2 enough to make an impact?
That is a good question. And there are certainly lots of other people that are more qualified to answer this question than I am. My understanding of it is that because climate change is cumulative, and so it's important to think about not just our yearly emissions of carbon dioxide, but actually the amount of carbon dioxide that has built up over 250 years of industrialization. The amount of reductions that we're seeing because of the stay-at-home orders that are happening right now is not going to be enough to play a really big role in climate change, even though it is reducing the amount or the projected amount that we're expected to emit this year.
All right, I think we do have time for one last question. Another one from Asher. When there are major bleaching events in coral reefs, how extensive and how quick are the impacts beyond those reefs?
That's a really good question. And I don't study coral bleaching, so I actually don't know about the time frame. The important thing to think about with coral reefs and things like kelp forests and some of these other ecosystems, there are, terrestrial ecosystems on land, forests and things like that are included, is that when you remove the structure from the ecosystem, it can have a really big ripple effect on everything else. And so having coral that's not healthy is also going to affect fish recruitment. It's also going to affect the algae species. It's going to affect all of the other types of species that we have in that ecosystem. And so something like coral bleaching, which might not seem like a big deal if it's only affecting coral at one type of organism, it's going to play a really big role in the entire ecosystem because of the role that species plays.
Wow.
All right. Well, yeah, I think that's about all the time that we have. Yeah, so I just want to thank you, Alex, for joining us. That was great. Yeah, again, for anybody who missed it, this will be on the Morehead Planetarium YouTube channel, so check it out over the next couple days. Next week, we will be joined by Linwood Webster. He will be talking about college prep in general, but then just kind of like getting into the mindset and kind of tips and tricks for what you want to do to apply to college, but then specifically how to go to college in a STEM field. So a little bit different, but super valuable. So hope to see y'all there. And thanks again for joining us.